and welcome to another episode from Restoring the Right Hand. I'm Dr. Tim Pernick, and today we're going to be discussing drugs. Now, there are a lot of authorities in the church who believe that the question about drugs is relegated to the past. That is, that the drugs that Ellen White warned about were things that were used in her day, such as mercury, strychnine, toxic substances, heavy metals, things that we don't use today. But I think that is an overly simplistic way of looking at the drug issue. And so one of the things I want to concentrate on is the opioid crisis and seeing if Ellen White's statements actually applied, considering everything we know. For those who are looking, there a series just came out on Netflix called Painkillers, which is based on a book by Barry Meyer, discussing or showing the sordid way that Oxycontin was marketed and promoted in the United States and the horrible toll it left in the lives of many people who did nothing more but follow doctor's orders. So since all these things are happening, I thought that I would show you another side to this. Because the opioid crisis is making its way in popular media again, I thought I would try to give a fresh perspective. This is Dr. John B. Hohen, who is a Loma Linda alumni and family physician. He considers himself a Seventh-day Adventist and has served in the mission field and as a family physician for quite some time. One of the things that he wrote, which caught my attention, is he wrote an article discussing the attitude of Seventh-day Adventists towards prescription drugs. He believes in this article, published in the Review, that Adventists have mistakenly applied the disparaging statements written by Ellen White toward modern FDA-approved pharmaceuticals. And this erroneous application is leading Adventists toward a dangerous distrust of prescription medicine. This distrust is entirely misplaced because, after all, the drugs in Ellen White's day were things like mercury, strychnine, arsenic, and opium. According to Hohen, her statements were before the FDA drug approval process and the seemingly heavenly appointed regulations to protect consumers. More modernly, Dr. John Shin, who was also a Loma Linda grad, is an oncologist and quite an intelligent man, and he did a talk before the Generations Youth for Christ in 2022 where he basically said the same thing as Dr. Hohen. Dr. Shin reiterates almost the same arguments defending prescription drugs from the more recent skepticism evoked by the pandemic. Dr. Shin goes further to point out how Ellen White endorsed vaccines after her mind was changed by physicians and a growing body of medical knowledge in her day. All this strikes me as odd considering everything that has transpired over the last 3 years of the pandemic, especially when it has come to light that the efforts made by the heads of the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease sought to suppress scientific dissent on lockdowns, or the fact that Pfizer, by its own public admission, never tested their product to see if it stops transmission, or the multiple studies which demonstrate the unacceptable risk of myocarditis in young people from taking the shot. It seems odd to me that Dr. Shin would essentially regurgitate the same pro-prescription drug arguments of Dr. Hohen nearly 20 years earlier, as perhaps these seemingly well-meaning physicians are mostly correct. We can trust the FDA, prescription drugs, and what we see with the pandemic is a one-off. Ellen White's statements really do refer to drugs in her day. If Dr. Shin is correct, then life can go back to normal, and we can place our trust in our institutions, knowing that we live in a fallen world, but we can trust the science of prescription drugs and those who regulate them. Or maybe we look at the warnings given to the church regarding drugs and ask ourselves if perhaps having skepticism towards drug companies and their products is in fact a healthy thing to do. While I don't expect this video to put this controversy to rest, I do want you to see that sometimes a leopard cannot change its spots. And the things we see today are the fruits of seeds sown long ago, even the late 19th century. To illustrate this point, I'm going to talk about the opioid crisis, but I'm going to start with some of those statements made by Ellen White, which are allegedly referring to drugs in her day. A physician who has the moral courage to imperil his reputation in enlightening the understanding by plain facts and showing the nature of a disease and how to prevent it and the dangerous practice of resorting to drugs will have an uphill business, but he will live and let live. I just want to stop right here. Even in her day, whether it be the late 19th century or the early 20th century, she understood that physicians who wanted to educate away from drugs, to emphasize prevention, and point people to the use of natural remedies, we're going to have an uphill battle. This is well before Big Pharma. This is well before the onerous regulations that are placed upon physicians and whether speaking or practicing without drugs. But back in her day, this was a problem as well. She goes on, he will not use his powerful drug medication Because of the knowledge he has acquired by studying books, he will, if a reformer, talk plainly in regard to the false appetites and ruinous self-indulgence in dressing and eating and drinking and overtaxing to do a large amount of work in a given time, which has a ruinous effect upon the temper and on the physical and mental powers. Knowledge is what is needed. Drugs are often promised to restore health, and the poor sick are so thoroughly drugged with quinine, morphine, or some strong health and life-destroying medicine that nature may never make sufficient protest, but give up the struggle, and they may continue their wrongful habits with hopeful impunity. Right and correct habits, intelligently and perseveringly practiced, will be removing the cause for the disease, and the strong drugs need not be resorted to. Many go from step to step with their unnatural indulgences, which bringing in just as unnatural condition of things as possible. Now, again, the arguments of Dr. Hohen and Dr. Shin are, well, this was back then. This wouldn't apply today. And while she lists some drugs here, she mentions two: quinine, which is still being used, and morphine. Both of those are still being used. And when she talks about morphine, it's quite interesting because people were developing addictions to morphine even back then, and it's still being used today in different forms. She's saying that if people would learn how to take care of themselves, they might not need any of those two. She goes on, the fourth case, the person to whom was given opium, was again presented before me. She had awakened from her sleep much prostrated. Her mind was distracted. She was impatient and irritable, finding fault with her best friends and imagining that they did not try to relieve her sufferings. She became frantic and raved like a maniac. The gentleman before mentioned looked sadly upon the sufferer and said to those present, "This is the second result of taking opium." Now, I just want to stop right here. In this vision that she has in 1889, which is published in the Review and Herald, she has a vision of essentially what seems to be an angel, which is showing her and these others what the effects of natural remedies and the effects of drugs and the effects of these bad habits are on people and how it's being treated. And right here, she's seeing what opium was doing to people. Opium was considered a common drug given, whether it would be through morphine, whether it be through codeine, whether it be through other means, it was being given. And she was being shown this in her day. Let me go on. Her physician was called, and he gave her an increased dose of opium, which quieted her ravings, yet made her very talkative and cheerful. She was at peace with all around her, and expressed much affection for her acquaintances, as well for her relatives. She soon grew drowsy and fell into a stupefied condition. The gentleman mentioned above solemnly, her condition is no better than when she was in her frantic ravings. She is decidedly worse. This drug poison, opium, gives temporary relief from pain, but does not remove the cause of pain. It only stupefies the brain, rendering it incapable of receiving impressions from the nerves. While the brain is thus insensible, the hearing, the taste, and the sight are affected. When the influence of opium wears off, and the brain arouses from its state of paralysis, the nerves which had been cut off from the communication with the brain shriek out louder than ever. The pain in the system, because of the additional outrage of the system, has sustained in receiving this poison. Every additional drug given to the patient, whether it be opium or some other poison, will complicate the case and make the patient's recovery more hopeless. The drugs given to stupefy, whatever they may be, derange the nervous system, an evil, simple in the beginning, which nature aroused herself to overcome, and which she would have overcome had she been left to herself, has been made tenfold worse by the introduction of drug poisons into the system. The result of these poisons is the destructive disease of itself, forcing into extraordinary action the remaining life forces to war against and overcome the drug intruder. Now, what's fascinating about this is that she's being shown right here the effects of opioid addiction, where the body becomes prostrate, where the nerves are inflamed with pain, where the person is deranged in their mind. This is exactly what she sees. And while we call it opium, we must remember that the derivatives of opium are quite varied. There's opium, there's oxycodone, there's hydrocodone, there's morphine, heroin. All of those things are there. And she's talking about how this was given in her day. And yet, it's given in our day as well. I was brought in the sick room of the first case, that of the father and his daughter. The daughter was sitting by the side of her father, cheerful and happy, with a glow of health upon her countenance. The father was looking upon her with happy satisfaction, his countenance speaking the gratitude of his heart. that his only child was spared to him. Her physician entered, and after conversing with the father and child for a short time, arose to leave. He addressed the father thus: I present to you your daughter, restored to health. I gave her no medication that I might leave her with an unbroken constitution. Medicine never could have accomplished this. Medicine deranges nature's fine machinery and breaks down the constitution and kills, but it never cures. Nature alone possesses restorative powers. She alone can build up her exhausted energies and repair the injuries that she has received by inattention to her fixed laws. Wow, quite powerful. I love this because, again, it isn't so much about whether it was the drugs in her day or the drugs in our day. It's very clear about what the effect of natural remedies nature can have of repairing the body. He then asked the father if he was satisfied with his manner of treatment. The happy father expressed his heartfelt gratitude and perfect satisfaction, saying, I have learned a lesson. I shall never forget it. It was painful, yet it is of priceless value. I am convinced that my wife and children need not have died. Their lives were sacrificed while in the hands of physician by their poisoning drugs. Again, Dr. Shin and Dr. Hone would say, well, that was way back then. That couldn't be today. The fourth case was again presented before me, the patient to whom opium had been administered. Her countenance was sallow, her eyes were restless and glassy, her hands shook as if palsied, and she appeared greatly excited, imagining that all present were leagued against her. Her mind was a complete wreck. She raved in a pitiful manner. The physician was summoned and seemed to be unmoved at these terrible exhibitions. He gave the patient a more powerful potion of opium, which, he said, would set her all right. Her ravings did not cease until she became thoroughly intoxicated. She then passed into a death-like stupor. The gentleman already mentioned looked upon the patient and said, sadly, her days are numbered. The efforts that nature has made have been made so many times overpowered by this poison that the vital forces are exhausted by being repeatedly induced to unnatural action to rid the system of this poisonous drug. Nature's efforts are about to cease, and then the patient's suffering life will end. That's pretty rough. Those who use opium cannot render to God any more acceptable service than can a drunkard or tobacco user. Those who break off the use of this nerve and brain-destroying practice will have to possess fortitude and suffer, as will the drunkard and the tobacco slave, when deprived of their body and mind-destroying indulgence. God is displeased that his followers should become slaves to habits which ruin the body. Nux vomica, or strychnine, and opium have killed their millions, and have left thousands upon the earth to linger out a wretched, suffering existence, a burden to themselves and those around them. Now, again, you must understand that opium was a prescribed drug in those days, just like derivatives of opium are still prescribed drugs. Nothing has changed there. She goes on. It is such work as this may be done that we wish to establish a sanitarium. We ask that you give a liberal donation. A great work can be accomplished for the Lord by a well-conducted sanitarium. We have demonstrated this in America. To our sanitarium in America at Battle Creek have come lawyers, doctors, judges, and senators to be guarded day and night against the cruel appetite for alcohol, tobacco, and morphine. Eternity can alone reveal the good that has been accomplished for them. They have gone forth to proclaim the glory of God, to honor his name. Now, this was published in 1900. What I like about this, she doesn't say opium here. She says morphine. And this is fascinating, as we'll see, because in the context that she's writing it, morphine becomes more prominent, and we'll see why. So here we have an article written in 1919 in the Journal of Social Progress, and this is talking about the return of the Spanish influenza. And if you look carefully here, you'll see a list of drugs that were commonly given. And in the list of drugs, particularly in the side talking about used in influenza, you have something called Dover powder. Dover's powder was a mixture of ipecac and opium. So they were even using that in 1919. In addition to that, if you go all the way down, you find that they are giving morphine as well. Now, why were they giving that? Because it would suppress coughs. It would reduce muscle aches and pains. They were using derivatives of opium and opium itself to treat this. Nothing changed. Even in Ellen White's day, she's warning about the use of opium and even morphine. She's warning about this, and they're still using it. What's fascinating is you'll see this. In 1901, in the St. Louis Medical Era, which is a medical journal, there's an advertisement that I found. And one of the things that happened after the Civil War, and one of the reasons why Ellen White, right here, instead of saying opium, she uses morphine, is that after the Civil War, many people began to use morphine because they had limbs sawed off, they were in pain, they had wounds, they were shot, very terrible, they were broken in life, and so they began to use morphine to reduce the pain, which many of them had, perhaps for legitimate reasons such as phantom limb syndrome. Nonetheless, as they began to use morphine, they became addicted. And like opium, it was an addiction, which is why she would say cruel appetite for alcohol, tobacco, and morphine. This opioid, which was thought to help people with pain suffering from the war and other things, was liberally used, so much so that it was still used in 1919 to treat influenza as well as opium itself. But notice this, to help people with this addiction to morphine, Bayer Pharmaceuticals decided to fix that. They came up with a new drug to help people fight the morphine addiction after the Civil War. Can anyone guess what that drug was that they came up with? Well, here it is, advertised by Bayer Pharmaceuticals in the St. Louis medical era in 1901. There it is by the red arrow, heroin hydrochloride. That's right. Bayer Pharmaceuticals figured the best way to fight addiction to morphine was to create another opioid, and that being heroin, that they would give. And notice what it says here, sedative for coughs and analgesic to help you with pain. If you don't go from one opioid to another, the drug companies aren't going to know what to do. And it's huge business because it's highly addictive. And once you get on it, you think you need it for the rest of your life. And as a matter of fact, when you come away from it, you are in extreme pain. And therefore you think, well, I'm in pain, I must need it. It is a vicious, vicious cycle. Now, while heroin is no longer a prescription drug, other opioids are, and their effects are no less different than what we read from Ellen White's own testimony. This is an excellent book. This is Radon Keefe's Empire of Pain, and this is all about the Sackler family, and he does a fantastic job describing how they came to power and how they used their marketing skills to create this need for OxyContin and how they were able to market it to so many and make billions of dollars. As a matter of fact, one of my criticisms is on some of the series that they're doing on Netflix and others, they try to make this look like the Sacklers were these right-wing industrialists, capitalists, and things like that. Well, if you read Radon Keefe's book, what you find is that the Sackler brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond, were actually all communists. And they believed that everything should be done in the public good. They were originally all psychiatrists, and they did not like psychiatry because they did not like doing electroconvulsive therapy. And one of the shows, they show them doing frontal lobotomies using stainless steel instruments to poke into the frontal lobe. They might have done that, but what Radon Keefe points out is that they didn't like using electroconvulsive therapy, which put people into grand mal seizures and caused memory deficit. They wanted to create drugs which would help, which is how they started to make their money through marketing of Valium. Valium was what helped them become billionaires and buy the company Purdue Pharma, which they would eventually create their other blockbuster, which was OxyContin. So I highly recommend it. Excellent book, worth your time to read, and it will certainly catch you up on the opioid crisis. Here is oxycodone, which is a derivative from the poppy plant where we get heroin, where we get hydrocodone, where we get morphine, where we get methadone, and all the other wonderful opioids. Oxycodone is a derivative of the plant, and it's the derivative of the plant is actually thebaine, which is just as addictive as any of the other substances that come from that plant. Quite impressive. What people must understand that the Sackler family did through Purdue Pharma is that they didn't invent oxycodone. Oxycodone already existed. What they did is they used a system that they had developed, the Contin system, which was a time-release system that they had successfully used in marketing morphine. They had a drug called MS Contin, and it was essentially morphine through time release, and they marketed it to doctors who were treating terminal cancer patients. And this was designed to help them deal with pain. And this time release system allowed them to take large doses. As the body began to slowly digest these different layers, they could get another dose of the morphine. And this made it easier for them to stay home, not be tied up to a morphine drip, and they could walk around and do everything before they died. Doctors didn't worry about them developing addiction because most of these patients were terminal. What the Sackler family realized and Purdue Pharma realized is that their product was only for a very small segment of the market, terminal cancer patients. And while they could make good money that, they wanted a drug that they could market to everyone for things like back pain, for shoulder pain, for knee pain, for arthritis, for any sort of work or accident injuries. And so they decided to take the drug oxycodone and develop a system of time release for it called OxyContin. And so in 1996, they developed it. And here's the patent that they filed to create this opioid formulation that allows a time release into the system so that you wouldn't get a toxic load of the drug into the blood. One of the reasons why they chose oxycodone is that doctors believed that morphine was addictive, rightly so. It is, but they weren't so sure about oxycodone. And so Purdue was able to exploit this gap in their knowledge by marketing OxyContin as non-addictive. Unfortunately, as they began to sell their product on the market, people began to notice, particularly newspapers, that things weren't going very well, that there started to be a spike of emergency room visits where people were using oxycodone from overdoses and people were dying. And they noticed that there was a correlation between the amount of drug on the market and the amount of hospital visits and the amount of deaths. And they could correlate these amount of deaths with the amount of prescriptions and the amount of drugs within the state. Now, while it is told when you see something like excess deaths and you see the uptake of certain drugs during the pandemic, you can't link the two. You can't say that, well, excess deaths are up because everyone was forced to take the project. They don't want you to say that. But yet here we are on March 5th, 2001, before the opioid crisis got out of control, and people were seeing and they're saying, hey, we noticed that the prescriptions are going up for this OxyContin. We noticed that emergency room visits for people overdosing, taking this drug, are going through the roof. And we noticed that people are dying. Maybe we should look into it. And unfortunately, people did not want to look into it. But the evidence continued to roll out. This is what the investigators wrote about in this article, Barry Meyer and Melody Peterson. Dr. Peter Leong recalls the day when he finally snapped at a drug company salesman pressing him to prescribe a more powerful narcotic painkiller called OxyContin. The drug's producer, Purdue Pharma, had already failed to persuade Leong with repeated offers of free weekend trips to Florida to discuss pain management. But when the salesman suggested that OxyContin, which was as potent as morphine, was safe enough to treat short-term pain, Leong exploded. We threw him out of my office, said Leong, who runs a pain clinic in Bangor, Maine. He thinks OxyContin is potentially too dangerous to use for anything but chronic severe pain. If Leong was not a convert, many others were. In a little over 4 years, OxyContin sales have hit $1 billion, even more than Viagra's. Although the drug has helped thousands of people in pain, its success has come at a considerable cost. An official of the Drug Enforcement Administration said no other prescription drug in the last 20 years has been illegally abused by so many people in such a short time. OxyContin has been a factor in the deaths of at least 120 people, and the medical examiners are still counting according to the interviews with law enforcement officials. And doctors like Leong, pharmacists, and law enforcement officials say part of the problem is that Purdue Pharma often oversold OxyContin's benefits without adequately warning of its potential for abuse. Its drug company was telling people that the benefits of their drug were really great, but didn't tell everyone that there were terrible side effects, and that almost sounds like history is repeating itself. Anyways, the company also used an often criticized but increasingly common marketing strategy, currying favor with the doctors in private practice with free trips and paid speaking engagements. Purdue Pharma, based in Norwalk, Connecticut, played host to hundreds of doctors at all expense paid weekends in spots like Florida to discuss pain management, a company consultant said. Doctors were then recruited and paid to speak to other doctors at some of the 7,000 pain management seminars that Purdue sponsored around the country. Those meetings stressed the importance of aggressively treating pain with potent long-acting painkillers like OxyContin. So doctors were to look out for people. The FDA was to look out for people, but this drug continued to roll in the market, though many knew that it was as addictive as morphine and was causing problems. Now, this doctor believed that it would help with pain, but he's been trained to think of nothing else but drugs. He believes that, hey, pills can fix anything. Clearly, pills did not, and it led to all kinds of problems, as we shall see. It goes on. As OxyContin's marketing message spread, the drug caught on with many doctors who medical experts said had little experience in prescribing powerful narcotics. As a result, they often could not spot those who intended to abuse it, the drug, or who did not need it. OxyContin, introduced in December of 1995, has offered patients something different, a tablet that slowly releases its powerful pain medication, permitting patients, for example, to sleep through the night. It's a good drug in the right situation, said Dr. Art Van Zee, a physician at St. Charles, Virginia. The drug has helped many people. Purdue Pharma officials say they have promoted the drug responsibly and would have disciplined any sales representatives who did not. They also said that in informing doctors about the drug, they told them how to spot potential drug abusers, and they have responded quickly to reports of spreading problems. Abuse, addiction involving OxyContin have spread quickly in the last 2 years, flaring up in at least dozens of states. And while the illegal use of OxyContin took root in rural areas along the East Coast, it has been moving into cities like Philadelphia. Nobody's immune from this, said Brantley Bishop, a narcotics investigator in Alabama. I'm seeing housewives. I'm seeing loggers, nurses, mechanics. It doesn't matter what they are. OxyContin was originally thought to be less prone to abuse because its narcotic was locked in a time-release formula. That meant it would not produce the quick spike of euphoria that the drug abusers crave. But the abusers quickly discovered how to disarm the time-release formula. They simply crushed the tablet, then swallowed, inhaled, or injected the powder to give them as high as powerful as heroin. Getting OxyContin was often easy. A person simply had to find the right doctor, claim intense pain, and get a prescription. Others just stole the prescription pads and wrote their own. Illegal use of OxyContin mushroom, even though no prescription drug in this country is more tightly regulated. Think about that. Think about that. Whole entire towns were utterly destroyed. People's lives were destroyed, though opioids were tightly regulated back then. So much for those agencies that do such a wonderful job looking out for the health of Americans. OxyContin is monitored by state and federal health officials and its production, marketing, and distribution. How many of those regulators are trying to figure out how the outbreak occurred and what they might have done to prevent it? The Food and Drug Administration, for one, is reassessing how it reviews prescription narcotics for potential abuse. We've learned something from this, said Dr. Cynthia McCormick, director of the FDA's Division of Anesthetics, Critical Care, and Addiction Drug Products. McCormick acknowledged that the FDA had failed to research all the ways abusers might tamper with OxyContin, an oversight she said her agency did not want to repeat. I want to stop right here. Notice the way the article is written. It's written that this is a good drug, but people are abusing it. It wasn't a good drug. It was a terrible drug. It was a drug that caused people to get addicted, and it was sold and marketed as if it wouldn't get people addicted. And as a matter of fact, the idea that they didn't know that people were crushing it up and snorting it or injecting it into their body was foolish. It turns out that Purdue Pharma had paid for a service, and this service would allow them to see real time where the prescriptions of OxyContin would go. And so they would know where each of these pill mills were. Sales reps made hundreds of thousands of dollars in commissions from these prescriptions being written at pill mills. And it's fascinating, as you would find in Radin Keefe's book, that when the lawyers would look over these notes, because all sales reps would have to make notes. After they would go meet with a doctor, they'd have to jot down notes. And these sales reps would talk about, when they would show up to the doctor's office, they'd see a line of people standing in the doctor's office. They say, wow, these don't all look like patients. Some of them look like they're there for other reasons. And they would write that. They would describe these lines of people there waiting to get their prescription of OxyContin. And yet, Purdue Pharma did nothing because this meant they were going to make tons of money. Not only that, but they made sure to market their drug in places which were economically depressed, where there was a high laboring class who would be more prone to use their drugs and get hooked on them. These were people who were not interested in breaking the law and using heroin or anything like that. These were people who were just thinking they were in pain and wanted to take a drug to get out of it. The article goes on. OxyContin came to market amid a distinct change in how doctors treated pain. For years, terminally ill patients suffered needlessly because doctors resisted prescribing frequent, potent doses of narcotics, fearing that patients might become addicted. But with new studies showing that doctors undertreated pain, OxyContin provided a breakthrough opportunity for Purdue Pharma. Until then, the company's biggest drug was MS-Contin, which had limited appeal partly because it contained morphine. OxyContin had broader appeal because it contained a synthetic version of morphine called oxycodone, which, among other things, carried less of a social stigma. Although the pain medicine had long contained oxycodone, OxyContin differed in two key respects. It had time-release formula, and it could be delivered in larger doses because it did not contain the type of non-prescription pain relievers that in larger quantities could cause liver damage. The FDA approved OxyContin for those with moderate to severe pain lasting more than a few days. OxyContin is often prescribed for people in chronic pain, like those with back problems or severe arthritis, as well as patients with cancer and other painful diseases. I just want to stop right here. This was an FDA-approved drug that was tested, that was put in the peer-review literature, that doctors swore up and down that this really works, said it was a good drug, and yet this drug, along with other opioids, was primarily responsible for the opioid crisis, which is ravaging the United States. Goes on. Managing pain. Purdue Pharma's critics agree that doctors must learn how to better manage pain, but Dr. Ted Perrin, associate professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine in Cleveland, worried that doctors in their rush to find a remedy may have been blinded to another problem: addiction. Pain medicine docs are on the mission, said Perrin, who teaches doctors how to use narcotics. In the process, they tend to trivialize addiction. Purdue Pharma officials said they were surprised as anyone that OxyContin, with its time-release formula, would be abused. Haddix of Purdue Pharma said he's thought the formula would make the pill less desirable to addicts. That's what you call public relations. That is not the truth. They knew better, and the evidence showed it. But at this time, in 2001, this is the song they were singing, and they would continue to see this song as they continued to rake in the profits. One of the ways that Purdue Pharma knew that their drug was highly addictive was not so much in the sales, although they could see that. It was in the fact that people were robbing pharmacies to steal it. In this article, in a magazine called CSO, which stands for Chief Security Officer, which is a trade publication where they would share information on how to keep their products safe, how to make sure that employees weren't stealing. One of the things they talked about was using RFIDs, radio frequency identification. And this was a way that you could put a small sort of RFID on packages and you could track where they went. So Purdue Pharma began to put this on their boxes and on their bottles so they could follow what was happening. And that way they could track how much they were losing when these things were stolen. And here is the chief security officer of Purdue Pharma holding a bottle of OxyContin, and they discuss how they knew their drug was being stolen. People don't go into a pharmacy and hold it up to steal Tylenol. They don't hold it up to steal Advil or ibuprofen or anything, but they will do that for something like OxyContin or oxycodone. Why? Because it is highly addictive, and they knew it. Here's another article. This article was published in 2001. A drug suspected in 282 deaths. OxyContin abuse, a rising concern. Now, again, notice the language used, OxyContin abuse. The drug wasn't being abused. It was being prescribed by doctors. And while there are people who figured out how to snort it and do all that, other people got addicted just taking it as prescribed. This is what it says. An extensive federal review of autopsy data found that the powerful painkiller OxyContin is suspected of playing a role in the overdose deaths of 282 people in the last 19 months, more than twice the number in some previous estimates. The analysis also found that virtually all the deaths were of people who swallowed the pill whole or crushed into powder, further suggesting that OxyContin misuse may be difficult to curb. Previously, the overdose deaths were thought to be people who injected or snorted crushed pills, which offer a quicker, more dangerous delivery of the drug. Asa Hutchinson, the nation's top drug enforcement official, recently called the new finding startling. The drug manufacturer Purdue Pharma acknowledged recently that even after reports that OxyContin had been getting into the wrong hands, the company continued to distribute free 7-day supplies through doctors as part of promotional campaigns. As I told you, they could see in real time where their drug was being highly prescribed. They could see that people were robbing pharmacies and drugstores for their drug. They could see that all in real time. And what did they continue to do? Give out free samples. Because why? They knew that once people got on their drug, they'd get hooked. This Drug Enforcement Administration study is the first to explore links between overdose deaths and a brand name drug. Previous reviews had looked only at drugs' active ingredients used by many manufacturers. Besides the 282 deaths, which often involved other drugs and alcohol, federal officials said they found that over 500 people had died since the start of 2000 from overdoses involving oxycodone, the active narcotic, and OxyContin, and other popular painkillers. Federal officials could not say whether the oxycodone linked to those deaths was from OxyContin, a drug for the treatment of severe and chronic pain. This verifies the fear and concern that we have had about this drug, Hutchinson said. Dr. David Galvin, a pharmacologist at the DEA, said medical examiners in 30 states had reported about 1,010 overdose deaths involving oxycodone since January 2000. Based on responses to date, the agency concluded that OxyContin was directly linked as a factor in 110 overdose deaths because tablets were either found in a person's stomach or a prescription for the drug was found on a body. Other confirmation came from reports on interviews with witnesses. Dr. Paul Goldenheim, the vice president for research and development at Purdue Pharma, said DEA's data were consistent with the company's findings, but he emphasized that none of the information implicated OxyContin in any of the reported deaths. Federal officials have said that abuse of OxyContin has grown faster than the abuse of any other prescription drug in decades. Purdue Pharma heavily promoted the drug as safer than other narcotics because its active ingredient was in the time-release mechanism. But abusers quickly learned that crushing the pill disarmed that feature. The company's salespeople gave doctors promotional material about OxyContin that contained cards which were given to the patient along with a prescription. A patient would take the card to a pharmacy for free dosages. Michael Friedman, Chief Operating Officer of Purdue Pharma, based in Stamford, Connecticut, said the sampling program was used to acquaint patients with the drug. That is laughable. It's exactly what a street drug dealer would do. He said the company had begun a new card program in July, but stopped it a few days later when the Food and Drug Administration placed the highest possible warnings on OxyContin's label. Asked why Purdue continued to offer free supplies in the face of mounting reports of abuse, Friedman said he considered the people receiving the cards from doctors to be legitimate patients. He estimated that the company had run 4 or 5 similar marketing programs for the drug in recent years, and that 8,000 to 15,000 cards were distributed each time. The fact that we're providing a sample to a patient has no connection to some criminal doctor who is taking money for prescriptions, Friedman said. Wow. It's not us. It's the abusers. It's not the fact that we're trying to get people hooked. It's those terrible abusers who just are taking the drug in ways that it wasn't designed. Now, what I dislike about this article, though I think it's revealing, they're talking about people who've died from overdose deaths. What is sad about this is the people who are addicted who don't die, who lose their job, who lose their family, who are out on the streets and still alive. And often these people, because they could no longer afford OxyContin or get a prescription, they would start using street heroin because it's cheaper. Those people aren't counted. Those people whose lives have utterly been destroyed are not counted. And there are many more thousands of them per whatever deaths that are recorded here. Meanwhile, the drug company, knowing full well what's happening in 2001, is still giving out free samples. This is another article, and this one talks about OxyContin abuse goes unmonitored. This article is fascinating to me because Purdue Pharma used their connections with their friends in government. What I love about the story of the Sacklers, as Radin Keefe tells it, the Sackler family were part of the New York elite, and they ingratiated themselves into the power structure with their cash. And all the universities were happy to take their money. The Metropolitan Museum was happy to take their art collection. Around the world, they were able to put art and artifacts and all these things, and they were friends with everyone, including those who were in the elite positions of power in both in government and social society and titans of industry. And so having their tentacles in all these different places, they could leverage their power to get things done that ordinary people could not. And one of the things that they were able to do is utilize their powerful political connections on both sides of the aisle to make sure that no legislation, no government action could be hastily passed that would stomp out their ability to make money before their patent on OxyContin expired. And so this is why this article is important, because OxyContin abuse goes unmonitored. As I told you, that Purdue Pharma already had a system where they could track prescriptions being written in real time, knowing where their drug was being prescribed, and the doctors who were doing it, they knew this, but they would not allow states access to this information to see it, because that would let states know who needs to be investigated and arrested. Here's part of the article. Just listen to this. An Indiana doctor described as a paid speaker for the manufacturer of narcotic painkiller OxyContin. Let me just stop right there. He was a paid speaker. That means that the sales reps and the managers and the people in the business knew what this guy was doing to generate money for them. They didn't just say, oh, this guy, Dr. Randolph, he's a nice guy. I love to play golf with him. He tells the funniest jokes. That's not what happened. They could see how much money he was generating for them. And they go, we got to take care of this guy. He needs to go on these vacations to Florida. He needs to be his paid speaker. That's what they did. So they knew what this guy was doing. Goes on. An Indiana doctor described as a paid speaker for the manufacturer of the narcotic painkiller OxyContin was under arrest yesterday on federal charges that he defrauded Medicaid by illegally prescribing hundreds of doses of the drug to a person connected to a drug-selling ring. Imagine that. The physician, Dr. Randolph W. Leveritz of Indianapolis, wrote more than $1 million worth of OxyContin prescriptions in the last 2 years, paid for by the state's Medicaid program, said criminal complaint filed on Thursday in federal court for the Southern District of Indiana. This year, Leveritz wrote OxyContin prescriptions worth $130,000 to a female patient who was part of a ring that sold the narcotic on the street. Federal prosecutors charged some prescriptions involved hundreds of OxyContin tablets. This doctor was raking in millions of dollars, writing prescriptions to people who would sell this drug on the street. This drug was a blockbuster drug on the street. And Purdue Pharma had to have known that the way this guy was writing prescriptions was not on the up and up. They didn't know exactly the type of people, like they didn't know what the people would do once they got the prescription. But what they did know is that he was running a pill mill, and they could see it, and they would do nothing to stop it because it meant gigantic amounts of money for them and for him. As a matter of fact, I remember distinctly a case in Florida where they broke up a pill mill ring, and they said that the doctor and all the patient visits that he had for these opioid drugs, that he was making roughly $30,000 a week and just writing prescriptions. $30,000 a week, just him alone. The article goes on. In the mountain coal fields of Eastern Kentucky, Sheriff Steve Duff of Harlan County recently noticed something curious. People driving to drugstores in neighboring states to fill prescriptions of a potent painkiller called OxyContin. Their reason, Duff believes, was to evade a monitoring system in Kentucky that tracks who gets potentially addictive drugs and who prescribes and fills those prescriptions. That system, the sheriff says, helped him arrest several dozen people last year on OxyContin-related charges. More significantly, it helped police stage Kentucky's biggest ever drug abuse raid, resulting in the arrest last February of 252 people in a sweep called Operation OxyFest. Just want to stop right here. This drug, FDA approved, peer reviewed, did not exist in Ellen White's day. It's not something she wrote about. And yet, our friends would have us to believe that her statements
about opioids
would apply back then, but not today. I think we're having a struggle here, and the bias is coming out quite clearly that we don't want to question drugs, period. Not because there isn't a reason to, but because we'd rather turn a blind eye to the medical paradigm that we have adopted. But I go on. But today, just 15 states have such programs because of decades of lobbying by drug companies. Let me stop right there. Did you just catch that? Kentucky had a state monitoring system that was able to determine where these opioids were being prescribed and how they're being prescribed. And that would allow law enforcement officials to investigate what was going on and get these drugs off the street and arrest those who were selling them illegally. That's at least a good start. But notice what the authors say here. But today, in 2001, when they're writing this, but today just 15 states have such programs because of decades of lobbying by drug companies. Doctors, pharmacies, and more recently, groups pushing for greater use of narcotics to control pain. Even states that monitor prescriptions, some programs are underfunded, crippling their effectiveness. Notice that. All these people work together to stop this monitoring because why? It's a safe and effective drug. FDA approved. You can't say that all these people dying when this drug comes on the market, that's correlation, not causation. You can prove anything with that. That's what we're told. And yet, as time goes on, those statements don't age well. The article goes on. Federal drug agents say OxyContin have played a likely role in the overdose deaths of at least 296 people since January 2000, in addictions that have overloaded drug treatment centers, and in crimes like thefts at pharmacies and on the street. Public officials say OxyContin's widespread abuse is also costing taxpayers tens of millions of dollars because so many people who misuse the drug get it through Medicaid, a government-funded healthcare program for the poor. Law enforcement officials say that if more states had good monitoring programs, they might have been able to crack down on OxyContin's abuse before it claimed so many victims. States with such programs like New York have seen little OxyContin abuse, while many without them, including Florida, Maine, and West Virginia, have been hardest hit. Most groups that oppose prescription monitoring argue that it violates patients' privacy, costs too much, or hurts those who really need the drugs by causing doctors to prescribe fewer and less potent drugs. But two government reports on prescription monitoring, one by the General Accounting Office in 1992, and more recently one by the Justice Department, looked at several of those claims and could not substantiate them. Prescription monitoring has long had some politically powerful opponents. Physicians do not want their activities monitored, said Carmen A. Catazone, executive director of National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. Drug companies are also a powerful lobby. Once a drug is monitored, sales decrease, and the drug companies don't like that. No, they don't. OxyContin, made by Purdue Pharma of Stamford, Connecticut, was originally thought to be less prone to abuse because its narcotic was locked in a time-release formula, but abusers discovered how to disarm the time-release formula. They simply crushed the tablet, then swallowed, inhaled, or injected the powder to give themselves a high as powerful as heroin. As a result of OxyContin's abuse, there are renewed calls for more prescription monitoring. At least in 8 states, including Connecticut, New Jersey, and Florida, are seriously considering it. And I just want to stop right here. I don't know if you recall this, but during the current pandemic, pharmacists stood as heroes, told by the government that they needed to stop people getting certain drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. They were told that you should stop filling these type of prescriptions. And these pharmacists stood up with their masks on, feeling very strong about what they were doing, how they were saving lives by not letting people get these drugs. And yet, here they are when it came to OxyContin, saying, well, there's nothing we can do. We don't want this to be monitored. We don't want people looking into the drugs. Hey, our hands are tied. If they write a prescription for OxyContin, man, I wasn't there. We got to fill it. Yeah, I know our pharmacy got knocked off the other week. People came in while we were out, crashed through there and stole our OxyContin. But, we just a lot of people in pain. Utter hypocrisy is overwhelming. They stood by and did nothing when this opioid crisis began. And yet, during the pandemic, with 2 drugs that had a long history of being fairly safe and fairly effective, they didn't want people to try them because it was impolitic to do so. When we were told there was only one way to lessen the harms of the pandemic virus, there was only one way, and that was to take the vaccine. Such hypocrisy. But I go on. In recent years, drugstores and pain specialists have been the most vocal opponents of monitoring. In North Carolina, a drug tracking system was defeated this year despite the state's recent problems with OxyContin. In New Mexico last year, the state pharmacy board repealed regulations needed to operate a tracking system after complaints by pharmacists and doctors who treat pain. The new Mexican system had operated for just 2 years, said Jerry Montoya, director of the state's pharmacy board. Pharmacists say they worry about the cost of reporting prescription data. For its part, Purdue Pharma said it was the only drug company that had publicly supported comprehensive monitoring programs. The company has even offered to help explain the benefits of the systems to physicians to gain their support. But Purdue Pharma's support is not unqualified. In West Virginia this year, Purdue Pharma opposed a bill with the help of a lobbyist that would have allowed a state to single out a number of narcotics like OxyContin for monitoring. West Virginia's legislature quickly passed the bill, but it was vetoed by Governor Bob Wise after doctors and pharmacists wrote him letters contending that the system would violate patients' privacy. Notice how they cared so much about patients' privacy, the rights of the individual to get the treatment they needed. Yet somehow during the pandemic, none of that mattered whatsoever. Oh, you want this type of drug, which is being talked about in a negative light by big pharma, by the media, by government? Oh, you can't have that. Yes, it's been approved by the FDA. Yes, it's been on the market for many years, but you can't have that. But back in the day, you needed those pain drugs, and they opposed any measure that would stop their ability to get those drugs to you. Just keep that in mind. After all those deaths, after all the people suffering from addiction, finally, in 2007, the information and the lawsuits were piling up. Now, Purdue Pharma was very intelligent. Anytime they would get a lawsuit or anything like that, they would find a way to settle and they would seal the documents. They would seal the documents so other jurisdictions could not go and look at it and find out what other lawyers had discovered, nor could they figure out the pattern of abuse that was going on. And this was very effective. But despite their incredible lawyers and their incredible lobbyists and their well-connected political rings that they had, the dam was starting to crack. And so in 2007, Purdue Pharma seemed to be up against the wall, and they were trying to figure out what to do. So they had to plead guilty in federal court to a misdemeanor. And here's the article. Abingdon, Virginia. The company that makes the narcotic painkiller OxyContin and 3 current and former executives pleaded guilty Thursday in federal court here to criminal charges that they misled regulators, doctors, and patients about the drug's risk of addiction and its potential to be abused. To resolve criminal and civil charges related to the drug's misbranding, parent of Purdue Pharma, the company that markets OxyContin, agreed to pay more than $600 million in fines. That is the 3rd largest amount ever paid by a drug company in such a case. Also, in a rare move, 3 executives of Purdue Pharma, including its president and top lawyer, pleaded guilty Thursday as individuals to misbranding charges, a criminal violation. They agreed to pay $345 million in fines. OxyContin is a powerful, long-acting narcotic that provides a relief for serious pain up to 12 hours. Initially, Purdue Pharma contended that OxyContin, because of its time-release formulation, posed a lower threat of abuse and addiction to patients than traditional shorter-acting painkillers like Percocet or Vicodin. That claim became the linchpin of most of the aggressive marketing campaign ever undertaken by a pharmaceutical company for such a drug. Just a few years after the drug's introduction in 1996, annual sales reached $1 billion. Purdue Pharma heavily promoted OxyContin to doctors like general practitioners who had little training in the treatment of serious pain or in recognizing signs of the drug's abuse in patients. But both the experienced drug abusers and novices, including teenagers, soon discovered that chewing an OxyContin tablet or crushing one and then snorting the powder and injecting it with a needle produces high as powerful as heroin. By 2000, several parts of the United States, particularly rural areas, began to see skyrocketing rates of addiction and crime related to the drug use. Misbranding is a broad statute that makes it a crime to mislabel a drug, fraudulently promote it, or market as an unapproved use. So these heads essentially pled guilty, paid a fine, and they were hit with a misdemeanor. None of them ever did jail time. None of those things ever happened. And as a matter of fact, after they went through all of this, each one got serious bonuses for their loyalty by the leaders of Purdue Pharma. That is the Sackler family. They made sure to take care of all 3 of these men for taking the fall for the company. This is U.S. Attorney John Brownlee, and he is one of the attorneys who was responsible for negotiating this plea deal where they would plead to a misdemeanor. Now, keep in mind that many people died. Many people's lives were absolutely ruined because of this drug. And John Brownlee could only get them to plead to a misdemeanor. And what's interesting is that on the hearings on Capitol Hill, when they were talking to him, some of the senators questioned why is it he could only get a misdemeanor, while others congratulating him for just getting that, essentially giving Purdue Pharma a slap on the wrist, even fining them $600 million. And if you add the other $34.5 million to that, still was a drop in the bucket compared to the billions they had already made. So again, some people have argued that U.S. Attorney John Brownlee was compromised by people in higher political positions connected to the Sacklers, who basically told him, if you want to have a political future, go ahead, get these guys, take the plea deal, and you'll be able to have a long-lasting career. It's the best you can do. That's what some believe. I want you to just get a glimpse of the human cost. This was an article published in 2001 in Spin magazine talking about the opioid crisis. And what's interesting is that they go through these stories of people who were addicted to this drug, talking about how they dealt with addiction and what they did. And I put a little statement here from one of the PR executives from Purdue Pharma, and this is what he says. "We are very hurt by this," he continues. "We feel that our company is being impugned. We feel an absolutely remarkable drug is being impugned. We feel that the movement to take pain seriously and treat people is being impugned. We don't believe that abusers and people with untreated addiction should dictate medical care for the remainder of the population. I have little tolerance for people who abuse this substance." Here they are promoting a drug, according to this article, the most dangerous drug to hit small town America since crack cocaine. And here is the head of PR for Purdue Pharma getting righteous indignation over the fact that their drug is being attacked. Not liking that. What's sad is that in this article, they talk about a young girl who started stealing her mother's prescription for oxycodone, and she began to take it, and it began to ruin and destroy her life. Another person, their wife got cancer, and she had a prescription for OxyContin, and they started taking some of the pills and selling them on the market and paid off all their debts because it was so highly addictive. Law enforcement agencies would bust doctors and go after people because they were making so much money giving this drug to people who were going to turn and put it on the street. Article is very gritty and brings out in morbid detail just how bad the addiction was using this drug. Now, I want you to see something here. This is essentially a pharmacopoeia written by John Harvey Kellogg in 1907. And in it, he lists all the drugs commonly prescribed. And he talks about this drug here. Yes, they were using morphine back then, no question about it. But they were using this drug too, called codeine. Codeine is another derivative from the poppy plant, which also has some of the very same effects as morphine. It was considered to be not as addictive as other drugs. And what's fascinating about this was often used in cold medicine and given regularly over the counter. This was done for many years. In 1956, which is long after Ellen White died, and this is as the FDA is developing, we find this article here. I'm not talking about the fluoride toothpastes they were advertising. That is pretty funny in itself. But this article here. This is an advertisement for a product called Coldine, and it's talking about how Coldine can help you with your cold and how it can help you with sneezing and sniffles and sore throat and constant coughing and tight chest and muscular aches. And how does it do all that? Well, it has some very powerful ingredients. Here are the powerful ingredients. The common cold is not a single, simple ailment. It is a disorder which attacks the various parts of your system, bringing a variety of miseries to different parts of your body as it develops and spreads. Coldine, unlike any nationally advertised cold and cough remedy ever offered over druggist counters, that's because it contains codeine and all in proper balance with other important ingredients. Doctors have prescribed the ingredient codeine for years because of its ability to provide long-lasting relief from coughs due to colds. They know it acts like a local anesthetic to quiet your cough reflex. Versatile codeine is a nerve relaxant, an analgesic, and painkiller. Yes, because it's from the poppy plant where you get opium and heroin from. The same place, but I go on. But powerful new coldine is more than codeine. The pictures show not only 5 stages of the common cold, but also show how many effective ingredients in coldine attack miseries, whatever the stage. Such ingredients on the label as codeine, ephedrine, ammonium chloride, and an antihistamine, methylpyramine fumarate, tell you why codeine is so powerful. Most powerful cold remedy you can buy without a doctor's prescription. At least 2, if not 3, of those ingredients are banned. You can't even use them. They don't even like to use codeine anymore because of its addictiveness. Ephedrine is banned as well. Listen to what it says. Number 2, sore throat. Here, codeine in coldine brings long-lasting relief from irritated membranes and tickling sensations. Many remedies do not provide sustained relief from these miseries. In addition, a demulcent syrup soothes the raw surface of your throat at the second stage. Coldine catches your cold. Constant coughing caused by sore or tickling throat? Codeine in coldine blocks irritation of the nerves, which produce coughing. And because it eases swallowing, it reduces tickling sensation. It helps bring relief at stage 3. Codeine catches your cold. Number 5, muscle aches. Besides their annoying pain, help create restlessness, increases nervous tension, retards slumber. Codeine and codeine is noted for helping to produce sustained relief from those torments, helping provide rest needed for normal recovery. Codeine catches your cold. Again, didn't someone write in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900 about substances taken from the poppy plant, whether it be opium or morphine, talking about their addictiveness and what they do to the body? Didn't she talk about people being treated using opium for colds and fevers and how they'd be given dose after dose? Could it be that no one learned anything at all, including people who had access to her writings? But people would say, well, that is 1956, the FDA, 1962. I mean, God set it up. I mean, that's what we're led to believe. What's fascinating is in 1983, in this magazine, Changing Times, which is essentially a business magazine, we find an article about cold remedies that work. And one of the things they talk about in cold remedies that work is codeine. Listen to what they say here. What the doctor would do. Taking a remedy containing ingredients that treat more symptoms than you have is an expensive and inappropriate way to handle a cold. A better tactic to deal with symptoms one at a time as they occur using non-prescription ingredients tailored specifically for each condition. Consider advice of an authority on the common cold, Dr. Charles Oldenbogen, Associate Professor of Medicine at Duke University and Director of Internal Medicine at Fayetteville, North Carolina Area Health Education Center. A menthol inhaler is a good and expensive decongestant. Nose drops or sprays containing phenylephrine or oxymetazoline decongestants are also okay if you use them according to the labeling instructions to minimize the risk of rebound congestion. For cough, codeine in doses of 10 to 20 milligrams every few hours may work, but it requires a doctor's prescription in some cases. In some states, the non-narcotic suppressant of dextromorphan with a dosage of 20 to 30 milligrams every 4 hours is a helpful alternative. Ask your pharmacist for the least expensive formulation in which the concentration of active ingredients has been shown to be effective for your symptoms. And this is what the other box says. Acknowledging long-standing concerns about the narcotic codeine, the panel has judged it safe and effective. Let me just read that again. Acknowledging the long-standing concerns about the narcotic codeine, the panel has judged it safe and effective as a suppressant with a low risk of addiction if used according to the labeling restrictions. The average adult dose is 10 to 20 milligrams every 4 to 6 hours, with half the usual dosage for children between the ages of 6 and 12. But check with your doctor before giving it to a youngster because codeine's drying effect, it may be inappropriate for patients with asthma and emphysema. I know that we think that we're so much smarter than in those days that doctors were doing those doses and things like that. But are we really? Yes, they were giving opium, but we're giving codeine. Yes, they were giving opium and morphine, but we're giving Oxycontin, oxycodone. Perhaps what we see is not so much us getting better, just getting more sophisticated in what we're doing, and the effects are still there. This was a fascinating article. This was published in November 2006 in Men's Health, and this is entitled The Junkie in the OR. And now I didn't understand this when I was first reading this article. I didn't know that the subspecialty of medicine that has the highest rates of abuse and addiction for opioids are anesthesiologists. I had no idea. And then you can see in this picture, they show the guy injecting with a small needle into his leg so no one would know. Turns out that there were a number of anesthesiologists who would be putting someone under. And when the surgeons would begin to ask the anesthesiologist questions, they would find him passed out at his station. Sometimes the anesthesiologist trying to put someone under would not give them sufficient doses, and the patient would cry out that they feel everything that's going on. And when the physicians would talk to the anesthesiologist, they would find them completely loopy and not understanding what's going on because they were hooked on these drugs. And you can see in the bold here, it says drug addicted doctors are passed around the country like pedophile priests because they have such a specialty and they have such critical knowledge for surgery. it's easier to discipline them and move them around than to completely get rid of them because they're needed for this. In this article, they recommend some things that the person who's going into surgery can do to make sure that their anesthesiologist isn't on a bunch of drugs. The anesthesiologist that they interview in this, who is quite forthcoming about his problems on how he got addicted to opioids. And he talked about how he would go into the pixie room and he would take drugs, or he would siphon it away from patients, and he would inject himself when no one noticed. He was caught because he was found passed out after doing it. And he started his whole addictive process by getting cough syrup that had codeine in it through a prescription approved of by the FDA. And he became an addict. Fortunately for him, no lives were lost under his watch, but it ruined his career. One of the interesting things that they found in this is that how regular Americans would also get addicted to these opioids after surgery. Men's Health wanted to put this in there, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Post-op addiction, how to get healed without getting hooked. Nearly 32 million Americans have abused OxyContin, Vicodin, or one of the other man-made narcotics known as opioids. They have the biggest potential for addiction because they get a buzz that you don't get with other painkillers, says Alan Lebovitz, PhD and associate professor of anesthesiology and psychiatry at New York University. Next time you need an opioid, use these strategies to keep the monkey in his cage. Know your drugs. The most addictive opioids are hydromorphone, morphine, and oxycodone, says George Woody, MD, a professor of addictive psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. If your doctor prescribes something on this list, ask to try an alternative opioid first, such as codeine. There's codeine for you, or hydrocodone. Better yet, see if a high dose of a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug is an option. Request a blend. Many opioids are combined with another drug, such as acetaminophen, in order to fight the pain on two fronts. These med blends are also less addictive since the total opioid content is less. Example, Percocet contains oxycodone and acetaminophen, while widely abused OxyContin is pure oxycodone. Never quit cold turkey. Decrease your dosage gradually per your doctor's orders in order to give the brain time to adjust. Tapering off over the course of several weeks will reduce the likelihood of withdrawal symptoms and in turn keep you from craving more meds. Don't up your dosage. If the prescribed dose isn't doing the job, ask your doctor about changing medication. Different opioids are designed to relieve different levels of pain. For instance, if you are in severe post-op agony, Roxanol may be the way to go. Moderate pain, Darvocet. And Darvocet was eventually taken off the market too because it was shown to cause liver toxicity. Again, even with trying to stay in the paradigm of managing pain, it still causes problems. Imagine if there were a group of people who were given insight, say nearly 100 years ago, who understood that maybe using natural remedies post-surgery to reduce pain, perhaps coaching people through it, helping them to understand what they were going through, mentally preparing them, using hydrotherapy, using herbs, using diet, using things, even preparing them for surgery by helping them detox and cleanse so their body would heal faster. Maybe they could have done something to stop people from getting off these drugs or getting on these drugs to begin with. But if only, right? Now, what's sad about this is that some of these doctors didn't do anything wrong. In this article in Men's Health, they discuss a medical journal article, which they theorize that one of the reasons why anesthesiologists get addicted to opioids and these drugs is not necessarily because they are giving them themselves right away. It's because when they're putting people under, the vapor from these drugs that they're giving to their patients is in the air, and it's such a low dose that it slowly begins the addictive process that when these guys finally take something, they are absolutely hooked. I love this little chart here over on the left side. 5 signs that an addicted anesthesiologist. Cold or flu symptoms. Sure, coughing and sweating could be legitimate symptoms, but then why is he at work? Most doctors stay home when they have a touch of something. Off-color comments. Narcotics relax inhibitions. If your anesthesiologist sounds less like a doc and more like a shock jock, lean in for a closer look at those eyes. Drug-addled eyes. You aren't checking for a bloodshot gaze, but rather for pupil size. Pinpoint pupils could mean he's recently shot up, and dilated pupils often indicate withdrawal. Mood swings. Because an addicted anesthesiologist needs a fresh shot every 3 hours or so, he can go from suave to snarly in the midst of explaining your procedure. Excessive overtime. Try and find out from him or a nurse if he's the go-to guy when a volunteer is needed. Grabbing a lot of extra shifts may mean he's staying near his supply. Think about that. FDA, peer-reviewed, tested, safe and effective drugs are getting doctors addicted, putting patients' lives at risk, who are then being given these drugs prescribed after surgery, and we're just told, don't blame the drug. I'm sorry. This type of tired rhetoric is made because people simply don't have the facts. The most disturbing part about this opioid crisis is that normal people who took their peer-reviewed, FDA-approved drugs as prescribed to them by a medical doctor became addicted and their lives were ruined. Additionally, as we read in the previous article, physicians breathing in aerosolized droplets of these drugs while doing their required job are finding themselves addicted. Perhaps we ought to take the focus off the addict and look at the drugs themselves. What about the FDA? Because we're told that the FDA, after 1962, really started to test not only whether drugs were safe, but whether or not they were also effective. We were also told that the FDA, the CDC, the ACIP, all these agencies were here to make sure that we were getting the very best substances to help fight the pandemic as well. And so here in this article, the FDA is being urged to get tougher on the maker of OxyContin. Told, hey, this is, you guys got to crack down, you got to do something. So here's some interesting facts about OxyContin and oxycodone. Oxycodone history. The active ingredient in OxyContin is derived from thebaine, an organic compound from the opium poppies, which have long been cultivated as a source of morphine. Historically, thebaine came from poppies grown in Turkey, India, and a few European countries. But in the late 1960s, British researcher Stephen King determined Tasmania, an island off the coast of Australia, would have been an ideal place to grow poppies. In 1996, the same year OxyContin entered the marketplace, Tasmania began producing a special group of mutated poppies dubbed Norman, which produced higher yields of thebaine. Today, Tasmania is the world's largest producer of opium compounds for the pharmaceutical industry. Wait. So why is it that opium is bad, but when it comes through a prescription, it's good, and people should say nothing and just accept that drugs are approved of both by the spirit of prophecy and by the government, and they're safe and effective? Sounds very confusing to me. Oxystats. In Florida from 2001 to 2002, 573 deaths linked to oxycodone. Oxycodone is the active ingredient in OxyContin. By comparison, 521 people died of heroin overdoses in the same time period. So what they're telling you is that oxycodone, which is the key ingredient in OxyContin, was beating out heroin deaths. Most likely to die, a white man aged 30 to 60 with back pain. Remember, OxyContin was being prescribed for people with moderate to severe pain, just regular people. So if you had back pain, you were given this drug and you got hooked. The makers of OxyContin refer to people who die while taking the medication as drug abusers. The company's drug abuse prevention programs have been aimed almost entirely at teenagers. They're not even stopping who their target audience is from getting their product. Medication linked to the most deaths. OxyContin in cases in which oxycodone deaths can be traced to a specific medication. 83% were linked to OxyContin produced by Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma, a privately owned pharmaceutical company, Stamford, Connecticut, founded in 1991. History. Psychiatrist brothers Dr. Raymond Mortimer Sackler purchased Purdue Frederick Company in 1952. Annual sales were $22,000. CEO Michael Friedman. Products include OxyContin, a time-release oxycodone painkiller, MS-Contin, a time-release morphine tablet, betadine antiseptic, and Senokot laxatives. 2002 OxyContin sales, $1.26 billion. So in this article, I want you to notice some things that the FDA is being told to do. This article was published in 2003. The federal agency that approved the drug OxyContin for moderate to severe pain is caught between defending a controversial product it approved and disciplining the company that makes the powerful painkiller. Some critics are asking the Food and Drug Administration to require tighter restrictions on prescribing of the narcotic made by Purdue Pharma of Stamford, Connecticut. The FDA has a responsibility to do much more to look at why OxyContin is being abused, how it is prescribed, what levels of pain require a drug such as OxyContin, and what steps must be taken to halt the abuse of these drugs so that we can stop people from dying, said Representative Frank Wolf, Republican of Virginia, chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that asked congressional auditors to investigate Purdue's marketing practices. The report was due on October 27th, but was delayed. A later deadline of November 17th also passed. In approving the drug in 1995, the FDA followed its routine policy for new medication. After reviewing clinical tests conducted by Purdue Pharma, the agency decided that OxyContin's benefits outweighed its known risks as a Schedule II narcotic with a high potential of abuse. However, once OxyContin was released, the FDA's role changed. One of the agency's job is to oversee how a company markets its drug, and it has the authority to reject ads and promotions. While the FDA can restrict how drugs are sold and pull them off the market, it has limited control over doctors, pharmacists, or patients. And that has prompted calls for the FDA to get tougher with Purdue. Representative Hal Rogers of Kentucky, a top officers with the Drug Enforcement Administration, want the FDA to limit the prescribing of OxyContin. The issue has created tension between the DEA and the FDA. Laura Nagel, diversion chief for the DEA, said she has tried to work with her FDA counterparts, but they keep trying to tell me I'm outside my box, said Nagel, whose office is responsible for enforcing laws pertaining to legally manufactured drugs. So we have little control issue working there. FDA officials did not respond to requests for an interview. Nagel's observation spotlights the disconnect between the DEA and the FDA about how to protect the public from a new generation of powerful painkillers. DEA reports nationwide show prescription drugs are abused almost twice as often as illegal drugs, such as heroin and cocaine. Imagine that. FDA approved, safe and effective drugs are being abused more than illegal street drugs. A DEA study stated almost 1 million people said they used OxyContin for non-medical reasons. Last month, DEA and FDA officials went head-to-head over proposals to restrict sales of OxyContin and a new Purdue drug called Paladone that scientists say is 10 times more potent than morphine. Nagel and other 2 congressmen want the FDA to limit sales of OxyContin to severe pain only, but so far the FDA has stuck with its original 1995 decision to approve OxyContin for moderate to severe pain. As for Paladone, a time-released form of Dilaudid, an FDA advisory panel supported Purdue's plan to introduce the drug in a phased launch that would include monitoring of doctors' prescribing practices and reports of abuse or addiction. The FDA has sent 3 warning letters to Purdue, including one that criticized the company for using contaminated alcohol in its production of OxyContin, leading to the recall of 388 lots of the tablets. The other 2 letters dealt with the FDA complaints about Purdue's advertising in medical journals. The FDA complained that one ad was misleading and the other promoted OxyContin beyond which have been proven safe and effective. Purdue pulled the ads. At other times, the FDA has sided with Purdue, and the FDA did not act on the DEA report that claimed OxyContin likely was involved in half of the 950 deaths studied in a 2002 nationwide autopsy review. It seems kind of interesting that the FDA is dragging its feet. They've written some tough letters, told them to pull some ads, but they seem to keep helping Purdue Pharma keep their product on the market as it's killing people and getting people addicted. The DEA's Nagel found allies in lawmakers Rogers and Wolf. The 3 agree that OxyContin can be useful for severe pain that cancer patients and others with similar conditions suffer, but they are keenly aware of the devastation that the drug has carved through Appalachia, where OxyContin became known as hillbilly heroin. This drug is tearing apart families, and it is ruining lives. It is stretching the resources of law enforcement and social service agencies to the absolute limit, Rogers told the FDA advisory panel last month. Wolf criticized the FDA as being slow to respond to OxyContin problems. He noted how quickly the FDA acted when it warned the public about the stimulant ephedra after reports showed 2 deaths, 4 heart attacks, and 9 strokes. I just have to stop right there. This is hilarious. Ephedra was an over-the-counter supplement that a lot of weightlifters used. It was definitely a stimulant. It was a way for people to cut weight, get thin, have energy. Definitely not good for you. And they took it off the market just after that. But OxyContin is causing people to get addicted, creating huge spikes in overdose deaths, and it still stays on the market, showing you the difference between those who are politically connected, powerful, and rich, and those who are not. And I love what the representative says here. Where's the same urgency with OxyContin? Now, I just want you to think back. Do you remember any time in some of the publications coming out of Loma Linda, maybe coming out of Adventist World, coming out of some of our other organs where they said, we need to have a firm talk about these opioids? Not now. I'm talking back in 2001, 2003. 2007. Any of the doctors get around and make statements and get on YouTube and say, hey, we need to have a discussion about this. This isn't good. We need to talk about how bad it is and these drugs and their abuse, and we should really get back to natural. No, you didn't hear that, did you? Why? Because the bias within our own medicine is so strong that we can't even find the courage to condemn something that is condemnable. But we're talking about the FDA. And we can see here that the FDA is essentially covering for Purdue Pharma. Why would they do that? Well, there's some good reasons here. This is the hearing on the Committee of the Judiciary of the United States Senate. And this was published in 2007. You see all the people on the committee here. Some of them are still in power to this very day, which probably isn't a good thing. Nonetheless, their conversations were very interesting. I encourage anyone to read it. I'm just going to include a letter here that was read in 2007. And this is what she says. My name is Marlene Skolek. I had a beautiful 29-year-old daughter named Jill. She had the misfortune of being prescribed OxyContin in January 2002 and was killed on April 29, 2002. Jill left behind her son Brian, who was 6 years old at the time of his mother's death. Brian is with me in the Senate today. Why did a $9 billion privately held pharmaceutical corporation take the life of my precious daughter? My work against Purdue Pharma for the past 5 years initially focused on J. David Haddocks, dentist turned psychiatrist and senior medical director of Purdue Pharma. I also focused on Robin Hogan, former public relations spokesman for Purdue Pharma. In 1996, the American Academy of Pain Medicine and the American Pain Society issued a set of guidelines for the use of opiates in the treatment of chronic pain. These guidelines were referred to as a consensus statement. The statement leaning toward a more liberal use of opiates was adopted just as the marketing push for OxyContin began. Wait a second. Here's this poor woman who lost her 29-year-old daughter, pointing out the drug companies manufactured this consensus to get their product approved and also promoted by the people who would have guidelines on how to treat pain. Goes on. This statement was produced by a task force which was headed by J. David Haddocks, former president of the American Academy of Pain Medicine, who was a senior medical advisor for Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. Haddocks was quoted as saying that the point was to gather consensus. If you are going to do this, this is how it should be done. There was a question as whether it was ethical for Haddocks to be associated with a pharmaceutical manufacturer to guide the formation of a document that would play a key role in promoting the use of products made by the company Purdue Pharma. When OxyContin was introduced on the market, it was intended for the treatment of cancer patients, and they were losing the patent on MS-Contin. At one point, in the greed and sheer evil of Purdue Pharma, they intended to market OxyContin to OBGYN patients. I flooded the country with emails and faxes to attorney generals and to the media reporting that we had had enough devastation in the country without addicting infants to OxyContin. This marketing ploy was terminated by Purdue Pharma. Pain patients from various pain societies will speak on the merits of OxyContin and their quality of life being restored because of the drug. These pain societies throughout the country are fueled by Purdue Pharma. Let the pain patients, not part of any funded pain society at Purdue Pharma, speak about the quality of life they have after becoming addicted to OxyContin. And when their physicians refuse to renew prescriptions for the drugs and they go onto the street to buy the drug because they can't kick the habit of this less addictive drug, ask the FDA and the DEA why OxyContin in such plentiful supply on the streets all over the country. Jill and thousands of victims of an out-of-control, greedy pharmaceutical company headed by 3 convicted criminals marketed OxyContin as less likely to be addictive and abused. There are assertions that the only victims in the criminal activities of Purdue Pharma were the physicians who were misled by Purdue Pharma sales representatives. The physicians who were used as pawns by Purdue Pharma were not ingesting a powerful narcotic that was being marketed as less likely to be addictive or abused. The patients were ingesting OxyContin and were becoming addicted and dying. If the patients aren't victims of Purdue Pharma's criminal activities, tell me what they should be called. The addictions and loss of lives because of OxyContin continue to impact every state in the country every single day. The far-reaching consequences of the criminal activity of Purdue Pharma did not end in 2001 or 2002 as they would like it to be believed. No one can turn the clock back. This has been allowed to become a national crisis because there was no conscience in the marketing of OxyContin. There was only greed. We all hear on the news every day about individuals who work for the government agencies or private industry who embezzle funds. Purdue Pharma has been criminally responsible for marketing OxyContin, which has resulted in death and addiction. Is it justice to have these three convicted criminals, these monsters, find an amount of money that is very well afforded by them, or will the Senate send a message that because of the magnitude of the crime committed, they deserve to be further investigated by the Senate? Anything that is imposed against these convicted criminals will not give us back Jill, but I will guarantee that Purdue Pharma will never forget the name Jill Skolek. When I began my work at exposing these three convicted criminals and Haddix and Hogan, I told Hogan that you messed with the wrong mother, and they did because my work is not over. I want to know why the FDA allowed OxyContin to cause such destruction in the lives of scores of innocent victims. I want to know why 12 warning letters were sent to Purdue for the marketing of OxyContin, and to this day, they were not required to put highly addictive or addictive on the label of the drug. I want to know why the FDA deleted, without reading, so many of my emails about the marketing of OxyContin until this last month. I want to know why Curtis Wright, while employed by the FDA, played an intricate part of the approval of OxyContin and then was hired by Purdue Pharma. I want to know why Attorney General Blumenthal of Connecticut citizens petition, which requests strengthened warnings for OxyContin as a result of information they uncovered in their investigation against Purdue Pharma, has been sitting at the FDA without any action since 2004. I want to know how Rudy Giuliani could be the big star hired by Purdue Pharma to play down the abuse and diversion of OxyContin and also get paid by the DEA for work performed for them. I want to know why the Sackler family has not been held accountable for their involvement with Purdue Pharma and the mass marketing of OxyContin. Eventually, Purdue Pharma will introduce another blockbuster drug similar to OxyContin, as they did with another devastating drug called Palidones. Palidones was removed from the market after a couple months. I'd like to think that my faxes and my emails all over the country played an intricate part in having it removed. My advice to Purdue Pharma is when you are ready to introduce another drug such as OxyContin or Palidones, look behind you because I will be right there. I will be working hard to have Howard Udell disbarred for his criminal activities and Paul Goldensheim medical license revoked for what amounts to being a white-collar drug trafficking. I will be actively working at Friedman, Udell, and Goldenheim never being able to work in the pharmaceutical industry again because they are convicted criminals who criminally marketed OxyContin. I will accomplish this, hopefully with the help of Attorney General Blumenthal. Do not doubt me at being successful at achieving this. Her name is Jill Carol Skolek. She did not deserve to be prescribed OxyContin and die because of the criminal activities of individuals at Purdue Pharma. Please give my family justice and investigate the criminal activity of Purdue Pharma. Thank you, senators, for giving me the opportunity to speak for thousands of victims of an out-of-control pharmaceutical corporation. That's really powerful. One of the things that I found interesting, she talked about the FDA's role in seemingly covering things up. How did they approve of this drug, considering that it was essentially oxycodone in a time-release package? What about the studies? What about these agencies which are designed to make sure drugs are safe and effective? How did this get through? I mean, she's perplexed. And she mentioned Curtis Wright, who was employed by the FDA. He played an intricate part of the approval process and then afterwards was hired by Purdue Pharma. This is really interesting. So I decided to make sure that this was actually true. Barry Meyer was a New York Times writer, and he did a ton of research on the crisis. And his book is now being used as the basis for a Netflix series with the same name, Painkiller. And what's fascinating is that in his book, he actually talks about this very thing. But the claim that FDA allowed Purdue to make OxyContin trumped all those warnings and soon became the linchpin of the company's massive marketing campaign. It read, delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. Prior to OxyContin's approval, regulators had debated whether to allow Purdue to make the claim. The FDA examiner who managed the drug's review, Curtis Wright IV, supported it, arguing that if one was concerned about a narcotic producing a sense of euphoria in a patient, it was right to use the medication that built up in the bloodstream more slowly and is not given very frequently. This is interesting. While they were doing the research, they were very concerned about this drug because they knew that oxycodone was very addictive. And Curtis Wright, who was on this board about this drug, convinced the people, said, hey, look, because it's time release, it can't be abused, and you don't have to take as many pills, so this is actually a win-win. But what we find later on is after he did all that to make sure the drug would get approved, Curtis Wright IV joined Purdue as an executive medical director with a first-year compensation package worth $379,000 in salary, bonuses, and other benefits. And that was back in 1996. That's good money today, and that was great money back then. So much for the FDA looking out for people. I know it's difficult to imagine that the FDA and people inside of it can be bought off. It's difficult to imagine that drug regulators and those who are in charge of making sure that the products that we take in our bodies are safe and effective. It's hard to imagine. It sounds like conspiracy theory, except for the fact that it's true. Until we take our heads out of the sand and confront these things, then I suppose we'll always assume that the testimonies, especially as they were regarding drugs, were just written back then, not today. This is an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and this was published in 2017, and they talk about the large settlement that Purdue Pharma had to make in 2007 of $600 million. And they talk about how they knew that the drug was addictive and all those other things. It's an interesting article, but it really doesn't give the truth about what was going on. Sadly, as the years rolled on, as the patent began to expire on OxyContin, eventually the mounting lawsuits and everything rolled in, and the Sackler family began to take larger disbursements of cash out of the company. And eventually they didn't have the money to research any more drugs or do anything else. Seeing that the ship was going down and seeing the lawsuits mounting up, they decided to make settlements. And so many victims from so many states wouldn't take the money that Purdue Pharma would offer. And so they said, well, if you don't take this money, if you don't accept this, we're going to declare bankruptcy. And once we declare bankruptcy, the victims, the people who've lost loved ones, the people whose lives are ruined, may get nothing, because once bankruptcy starts, the judge has to divide up all the assets and sell everything off. And then as they sell things off, they have a limited amount of cash that they can actually give to settle the lawsuits. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the plaintiffs said, no, we're not taking this money. You need to pay us more. And I think it was up to $6 billion at one time. What's interesting about that is that within the 10 years or so that the drug was on the market, and it was on the market longer than that, but within 10 years, they estimated that the Sackler family, which came up with Purdue Pharma, that they made over $38 billion. $38 billion in 10 years. That's a lot of money. What's interesting is that another company made $38 billion, but they did it in 1 year. And you know what their product was? An mRNA vaccine for COVID-19, and that was Pfizer. This is a recent article published by NPR in August of this year, 2023. And what the article discusses about how the Supreme Court temporarily blocked a $6 billion Purdue Pharma Sackler bankruptcy. So they were going to pay out this money given to all the victims as compensation, only that the Sackler family would be given immunity from any prosecution. And the plaintiffs were like, hey, you can't do this. They appealed to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court blocked this. So they're going to be investigating to see whether or not the Sacklers can do this and whether or not this would be adequate compensation for the victims. Unfortunately, as I said, the Sackler family were very well politically connected, and their political connections probably are still within the halls of Congress in different states, and they had a lot of influence. What the Supreme Court will do, how fair they will be, is anyone's guess. Unfortunately, many federal judges and Supreme Court judges have a bias in favor of corporations and wanting to protect them. And it's sad because some attributed over 800,000 deaths to the use of OxyContin alone. And yet, $6 billion when they made over $38 billion is still, even though it's a lot of money, a drop in the bucket. And considering the many thousands of people who were injured, it may mean pennies on the dollar to those who've lost everything. And so as we think about this, as we look back, were the warnings made against drugs just something that should be in the time capsule of the late 19th century, early 20th century? Or were these warnings something that we should have listened to all along? Could you imagine If there were people out there who were in the medical industry who warned of the use of any opioids or found other alternatives to help people manage pain, whether it be low-level laser, whether it be massage, whether it be hydrotherapy, whether it be certain dietary restrictions, whether it be herbs, any of these natural products, could you imagine what that would have done for so many lives? It's hard to imagine. And unfortunately, because of the bias that is within our medicine, we didn't do it. And instead, look at what we've reaped. I think it's time for us to reconsider some of these interpretations. And instead of saying it doesn't apply, maybe we should go with the premise that it applies first until it doesn't. And that might be the safest approach. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you were blessed.